I can't believe this. It's like the devs read my mind from the past and now the timelines have merged. Yuri's Revenge is a resounding yes and thumbs up. But before we get into it, what is Red Alert 2 Yuri's Revenge? Yuri's Revenge is the expansion for Red Alert 2 released in 2001. If you haven't watched my Red Alert 2 review, I highly recommend watching it because that is going to give you the baseline and context for this review as it obviously builds on the previous game. I'm going to make some corrections to my original review. The first being that I was wrong about prison tanks. They don't chain like the towers do. It just kind of looks that way from the AoE effect, and the damage is so high that it kind of just feels like it. The second correction is that Tiberian Sun and Red Alert 2 are not strictly 2D games. While I still believe that they can be considered 2D games for review purposes, the maps are 2D, but all the units are 3D voxel models. So there you go. It's an outstanding effect, and I stand by what I said. I want this graphical style to come back to RTS because it holds up so well. So here's a recap. In short, the Soviets invaded the US, the Allies then fought back, and the war concludes, but the Soviet advisor Yuri, who is a psychic mastermind, retreats from the conflict and amasses his own army, along with a plot to bring the world under his psychic influence. The campaign has you either taking sides with the Allies or the Soviets in an attempt to thwart Yuri's evil scheme. So who do you choose? Well, again, choose the Allies if you're boring, though one could make an argument that Tanya is still hot. It was true in the base game, and it is true again in the expansion. Soviets just have more fun. It's also nice that Yuri's forces are mostly fleshed out and a unique faction within the Red Alert series, and this is the first time we see 3 factions, though admittedly in the campaign you only fight against Yuri's forces. You'll have to go to skirmish or online play to play the faction for yourself. Overall, there are 7 solo missions for each faction, not starting with the letter Y, and plenty of opportunities to really flex and try out the new toys. So what's new here? As you might recall, the Soviets have more of a might is right approach, while the Allies have more of a hit and run or a specialization approach. There is a bit of overlap and these roles swap in naval engagements, but you get the gist. The Allies get the Guardian GI, which is basically an anti-tank and anti-air GI that is extremely slow and can't be run over once deployed. Since Yuri's shtick is mind control, you also get access to robot tanks, or drone tanks if you will. They require an extra building to build them, and you lose control of them if you lose power, but they can't be mind controlled. Another added bonus is that they hover, which is pretty handy. They're kind of weak individually, but their utility against Yuri's forces can't be understated. The battle fortress hacking rocks. It does what it says on the tin. You can put 5 troops in it and they can all shoot from within. Additionally, there's a machine gun and you can run over tanks. That's right, you can just flatten tanks. I think my favorite was putting Chrono Legionnaires in these, but it's kind of expensive. There's a lot of flexibility here, though admittedly it's quite costly. Now, of course, the IFV is not new, but because there's a new faction and the Allies can steal tech from other factions, it means that the IFV gets a few extra turrets. For example, placing a Guardian GI in the IFV will upgrade the missile turret to be more effective. As for the Soviets, you get Romanov. I mean, look at this guy. Have you ever seen such pizzazz? Now, the Soviets finally get what they have deserved from the beginning, and that is a commando of their own. I have no idea what took Westwood so long to realize this, but I'm glad they came around. In one of my favorite missions, you get to command Tanya and Boris, and I think that they make a super cute power couple. Anyways, Boris plays pretty much like Tanya, except he has an AK, and instead of using C4, he paints targets with a laser, which then calls in MiG fighters to fire down on the target. Additionally, we have the Siege Chopper, which shores up one of the weaknesses of the V3, that being that they can be intercepted and there's a long travel time. Siege Choppers can also simply lift into the air if they aren't countered by the right units, so it makes them really handy for harassment. As for buildings, the Soviets gain the ability to build battle bunkers, which can be garrisoned by conscripts, and the industrial plant, which essentially reduces the build times and costs for vehicles and or refineries. In addition, the Soviets get a spy plane as a support power, which, you know, spies. Also, all factions get a force field, which is designed to protect your buildings from super weapons at the cost of depowering your base for a while. Now, obviously, with Yuri being an ex-Soviet defector, it means that the Soviets lose cloning bats, psychic sensors, and the psychic commandos, but I mean, I have a chopper that is also a howitzer. I hardly care. Onto Yuri's faction. I'm not going to go over every unit here, but I'll give you an abridged tour. Yuri's conventional weaponry comes from the $2 store and it's fairly easy to deal with. What's not easy to deal with is when your own units start attacking you en masse. Don't worry though, it's not all tricks. For example, Gatling tanks and cannons start off weak, but they wind up to dish out excruciating damage if left unchecked. The magnetron uses a long-range magnetic beam to levitate your vehicles and pull them towards Yuri's forces, or do high damage to buildings that can't be lifted. Probably one of the more weird ones is the floating disc, which is literally a UFO with a laser. If these are allowed to hover over your crucial structures, they can do nasty things like depower your base or siphon off credits. Coming back to the mind control aspects, Yuri does have a mind control tank that takes control of every unit in the vicinity, the catch being that if you overload it blows up. Yuri also only has one combat unit for naval warfare, and that is the Boomer submarine, which doubles as an anti-ship submarine and a V3 rocket artillery for bombarding the land. Defensively, as I mentioned, there is the Gatling cannon that winds up over time, and the psychic tower, which will pluck up to 3 of your units to fight against you until you destroy it. As for special powers like the Chronosphere and Iron Curtain, Yuri gets Domination, which is an AoE that damages buildings but also permanently turns any units over to Yuri's control. The other power is Mutation, which is an AoE that turns any infantry units into brutes under the control of Yuri. Brutes are Hulk-like berserkers, and it's not fun when your defensive line of GIs turn into Mr. Hyde and decide to trash your base. Other than that, you're going to see a lot of parallels in the buildings, though Yuri does handle cash flow a little differently. For example, any mind control units can be sent to the grinder to be recycled for cash. Also, Yuri's forces don't use refineries, but rather portable slave miners that can drive out and release slaves to mine for them. Now, moving on to the game itself, I think the first thing that really jumped out at me was how much Tanya's voice lines improved. It was instantly noticeable to me that Tanya in the cutscenes was more in line with the Tanya in the game. But as you keep playing, you then start to notice it's not just Tanya. Everyone has gotten a glow up. Where before there were a series of vehicles that had all the same canned voice lines, there are now voice lines for each individual unit. It's a really nice touch that has an almost exponential effect because it leans even harder into what Red Alert 2 was already good at. Red Alert 2 provided a world of imagination and variety where you kind of feel like there isn't really more that you could do to enhance this aspect much more than it already has. And then Yuri's Revenge just does. Another aspect is that Yuri's Revenge just knocks out of the park the mission themes and the scenarios. There's far less in the way of puzzle missions where you're dealing with limited resources and you have to accomplish a particular objective. Rather, Yuri's Revenge is focused on giving opportunities to the player to indulge in the more fun and weird combos and ideas. There are multiple scenarios where the game just hands you the controls of both factions at the same time, and you know how weird things get when you put Soviet units in Allied vehicles. It's not only that though. For example, the Soviets get a bespoke mission on the moon with a unique unit called the Cosmonaut. That is basically an astronaut with a laser. I mean, holy moly, there is nothing more awesome than a Cold War turned hot on the moon. And someone needs to actually reboot Battlezone properly, but I'm way off topic. The Soviets also get to travel back to prehistoric times and fight dinosaurs. So I don't know, Tanya might be hot, but when do we come to the realization that it was actually Lieutenant Sophia that had your back all along? Anyways, the Allies also have their moments, but it is what it is. The Soviets are just more fun. Like Red Alert 2, we get to jet set and do some sightseeing. Big Ben and the Sydney Opera House come to mind. There's also the pyramids with mummies and Hollywood movie sets with action hero actors taking the fight to Yuri. I'm not going to talk too much about the visuals because, well, they're the same visuals as the last review, but I think the sheer breadth of places and things that the game shows you is just delightful, and I don't know how anyone could play this without a smile on their face. The bangers are back with Frank Klepacki. Admittedly, the soundtrack doesn't quite stand out like the original, but I mean, it's pretty hard to iterate on perfection. And I'm sorry, but if you aren't working in your feelings of helplessness is your best friend Savage into your workplace conversations, then you didn't listen to the soundtrack long enough.
Your feeling of helplessness is your best friend, Savage.
It's so incredibly catchy and probably the winner of the soundtrack. Let's talk about the plot. The Red Alert series has always been centered around time travel. Yuri's Revenge is kind of the first time where we have time jumps within the campaign. It's best not to think too deeply about it, just appreciate it for what it is. I'm not going to fault the minor details when it's really an awesome vehicle for the wackiness which is Yuri's Revenge. Both the Allies and the Soviet campaigns have you traveling back to the start of the war to try and undo what Yuri has done. Now, the cutscene games seem lower budget, you have more zoomed in content, and this is understandable. However, where in Red Alert 2 there was a severe disconnect between the faction storylines, Yuri's Revenge seems to fit together better. Both factions time travel to the start of the war, both factions form a temporary alliance with each other, and both endings have the same functional outcome but differ in approach. Overall, it just feels like a tidy and satisfying story that, along with the in-game elements, attempts to address the disconnect in the story of the base game and the inconsistency of its characters. I think if I could level any criticism at Yuri's Revenge, it would be that I don't think that the devs took Yuri's naval and air units seriously enough. Like, yeah, I get that it's fairly balanced and every faction has strengths and weaknesses, but there is literally one air unit and one naval unit, and they are both super units that fulfill multiple roles. Don't get me wrong, I really like the UFO. I thought it was so funny the first time I saw it. I just mean that it feels like the Navy and air aspects were kind of neglected as a design space. It's not a criticism that is dear to me, and it sits fairly low in comparison to the praises, but I thought it was worth a mention. So, is Red Alert 2 Yuri's Revenge a good game in 2023? It's a phenomenal expansion to Red Alert 2. Red Alert 2 is already a really good game. By the way, I see that a lot of you complained that I scored the game too low. Sit tight, I'm going to be addressing how I rate games really soon. But yeah, Red Alert 2 is one of my favorite games of all time, and Yuri's Revenge just makes it better. I'll go as far as to say that Yuri's Revenge is a compulsory addition, and not because it fixes the problems of Red Alert 2, but more because it just signal boosts the best aspects of the base game. Gun to my head, and it's my own mind, I give Red Alert 2, with the addition of Yuri's Revenge, an 8.5 out of 10.